Let's go to it. Let's do political crazy. Do. Okay, what's our quote for the day? When you receive a subsidy without a quid quo pro, there's no incentive to be more productive in the future. True. As a result, productive activity, and long-term forecast decline, leading to the infantilization and moral degeneration of civil society. Yeah, I could agree with that. Daniel Moreno Viden. Sometimes you get some weird ones, like a character from a movie. He does strange quotes sometimes. And a lot of the time it's people in his comments.
Hey internets, when it comes to the type of people who will try to argue that culture does not matter, you may have found that they mostly fall into two different camps. The first of these camps is the projector camp, the people who will accuse others of being distracted by the culture war, despite the fact that they themselves are very much ingrained in the culture war. These people usually tend to be the progressive woke types, but I've seen this behavior from non-wokes as well. And I've already made a video on this camp and why they are wrong. TLDR, they just kinda lack self-awareness. However, there is another camp of people who will also try to argue that culture doesn't matter. And this is a camp of people who are not really projecting. These are people who genuinely believe that culture does not matter. Or at the very least, they'll try to downplay the importance of culture by calling anything that talks about it, quote unquote, culture war schlop, and just using that label as an argument against the topic altogether. And they genuinely make an active and determined effort to distance themselves from anything you can call a quote unquote culture war. And because I see this camp a lot more within some of the more academic, higher IQ libertarian circles, I'm going to focus this video on this group and why I believe they are making a very grave mistake. And what I see instead is a lot of libertarians thinking that they can just exist somewhere on the internet in some Rothbardian Discord, discussing natural law theory with each other and having a good old time. Honestly, nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with that, but at the same time, that's the problem with libertarians is they're singleists in like the median of the road. They're not left, they're not right, but they do want to act on their own singularly. So they go, oh, well, I don't care about what people are saying online about the culture war, about memes. I don't care about it. Well, it's great that you don't care, but there's stuff happening there and you should acknowledge that it exists.
In fact, it's pretty based. But the issue comes in when a lot of them start thinking that the solution to society is for everyone to just wake up one day and come to their senses and for the whole world to just come and join them. And spoiler alert, unfortunately, this is just not going to happen. It would be nice if it would happen. It would be absolutely wonderful if people would just suddenly magically
He loves his fallacies. The if someone would just fallacy is a great one.
Start being smarter, but it's just not how human psychology works. And it's also libertarians giving up a very good strategy that I will go into more as this video goes on. And so I will explain why this mistake is costing the libertarian movement to have any chance of any real victory within our lifetimes. But first off, I'd like to thank this video's sponsor. Anyways, let's start things off with why the quote-unquote culture war actually matters, with the main reason being that culture is intrinsically connected to everything else.
I wish I knew what this game was. He plays it all the time, and I have no clue what this game is. And it looks pretty fun
In society, and there's really no way to disconnect it. When you look into culture and how it influences society, you'll find out that there's a lot of disagreement. But a lot of people argue that it flows in specific directions. For instance, people will say that politics is downstream from culture, but that's not the complete picture. As I went over in my old video on culture wars, culture is also influenced by intelligentsia or the cathedral and media and academia, etc., etc. And the thing is, politics can also give power and funding to that
was a long video.
And the thing is, anybody as an individual can choose to act on any one of these structures of power in order to try and influence things into their desired direction. So for example, you actually can reverse the normal direction that this kind of influence flows by joining politics and then using that political position of yours to defund certain research groups or defund or delegitimize a media organization somehow that's pushing a cultural idea, and through that you will have influenced culture through politics.
It's salmon going against the flow of stream. Like, it takes more effort, but through a different mechanism, you can go up the stream. You can work in the opposite direction. I wouldn't say it's this circular cycle. It's it's multi-branching, but some of the branches have different pathways to go to each other. The downhill, the downstream from culture kind of thing. Politics is downstream from culture. I'm not. I don't follow that logic so well, but it's, if you're gonna say it, that I think that's a better analogy, is that you can go up a stream. There are ways to backflow up a stream, because it is still kind of this linear way that people interact. There's stages to how people interact. It's hierarchy, top down.
And because culture can influence politics, culture is therefore a power structure that is just as legitimate as any other political or intellectual institution. And we kind of saw a recent example of this with Elon Musk and Doge. Doge defunded a lot of media contracts the state had with the media because those contracts had a specific ideological bend to them, which caused the media to move a little bit more to the center, which is why you may have noticed in the last 2 years or so that culture itself has kind of been moving more to the center. That doesn't mean that woke ideology is dead. The wokeists absolutely still believe what they believe and are basically just biding their time to make a comeback, as evidenced by things like the mixtape fiasco, which basically reveals that the neo-Marxists are still very much in charge of most of the media. But again, things have at least kind of shifted away from them just a little bit. The point is, it all connects, and one of the reasons it connects really just comes down to human psychology, which is kind of the biggest flaw I see with the types of libertarians who believe that the culture war shouldn't matter to libertarians at all. It is often people who are philosophy-minded themselves, and they're making the mistake of psychologically projecting that mindset onto others. But the thing is, most people in this world do not think like that. And so here's some statistics and some studies that will give you some better insight into the psychology of your average person, to give you all a better understanding of what I'm alluding to here. Let's start with religion. Globally, close to 90% of the population will end up just staying in whatever religion they are raised in for pretty much their entire life. It varies slightly.
You're raised in and around people of the same religion, and so you tend to form your worldview around the same ideas that they did, and it perpetuates the religion. So that's makes sense.
From religion to religion, and it can also vary slightly based on the economic status of the country that the person is living in. But at the very least, even in the highest conditions where people have access to free information, this statistic still remains above 50% for most religions. And some people might wonder, okay, why does that matter? Well, what it is, it's kind of the single most obvious proof that the average person really just adopts the ideology and the morality and the belief system of their peer group that they're raised in. They don't really question it. They just kind of go along with the ride. And the thing is, this mentality of the average person extends into more than just religion. There have been many studies on things like this, the development of moral values in cultural contexts. The TLDR of it is that a very sizable chunk of the population largely gets their morality and their sense of ethics in the cultural context of just kind of interacting with others and emulating others' points of views, and then ultimately just adopting the morality of their peer group. It's something that starts at an early age. It doesn't really come from a place of aggressively studying philosophy or anything. For most people, it's actually a very simple thing, and it starts very early.
It's ideology forming around a common set of morals, a common set of worldviews that you see in the people that have been around you while you've grown up. So while your brain is still plastic, that's all the way till you're 24, I believe, is generally accepted that you form worldviews till then. So it's this long period of time. It's not just your immediate family, but you're always around your family in a good environment. But then it's also friends and whatnot. So there's people that you're around, they form an ideology. When you share a religious component, like there's a creator or something like that, there's a higher power, even if it's just a spiritual component, then you elevate it to, oh, well, it's my religion, not just ideology. But that's true of anything. We can see that in wolves, we can see it in foxes, we see it in ferrets. There's a bunch of animals that we see it in otters especially. There's a bunch of animals that, depending on the environment they're raised in and whether or not they stay nearby the rest of their family, their lifetime, they intermingle, or they go way the hell apart depending on how food is. They have to do that sometimes. That changes drastically how they interact with the world around them and what choices they make, how daring they are when it comes to making not the smartest of choices, but it influences their entire mental process. And that's true of any and all animals that have a family structure. And we just extend that to full ideology when it comes to sapient, sentient creatures like humans.
And psychological development. This one can be hard to exactly measure because it's kind of a qualitative thing, and of course there's the thing of revealed preference versus stated preference. But when asked about it in the United States, only 7% of people say the media is not a factor in shaping moral values. Of course, depending on people's belief systems, they disagree on whether that's a good or a bad thing. But most people, at the very least, admit that we do get these things from the media.
Because
in other
the media
words,
is
culture
part
has
of
a
what's
very
around
strong
you when you're
impact
growing
on
up.
how the average person views philosophy. Because these are the same things that people discover through philosophy. What is correct? What is moral? What is true? And the reality is most people are not really interested in studying these things at any kind of academic level. In other words, yes, the layman unironically kind of got their morality from watching Bambi. You can say that that's stupid, but it is how people think, which is then further proven by a lot of other things. For instance, the fact that there is a sizable chunk of the population that just wants to believe what the group believes. Combine that with things like cultivation theory in the media, which shows that people are more likely to believe that the rest of the world aligns with the messages and the morality that is being portrayed on images and TV shows, etc., etc. And it becomes very obvious just how much this can influence the mind of the normie. And here's the big kicker on top of it all.
That's why
the
echo
interest
chambers
a
work,
person
too.
has in going deeper into philosophy and studying things like ethics and natural law theory, for example, for libertarians, greatly differs by average IQ. And the thing is, we know by this point that at an individual level, this is largely genetic. In other words, Tyrone and Cletus are never going to become well-read philosophers. It's just not going to happen. They are going to get their philosophy from a combination of Saturday morning cartoons, Skibbity Toilet, and whatever their fourth grade teacher had to say. And then
So a bit of an element there. It's not that IQ is genetic entirely. It's also environmental. It's capitalizing on having that genetic disposition to have a higher or lower. If you have a high chance of developing a good IQ, you still need to have the environmental factors play out so that you actually capitalize on it, go to school, all that. There's more to it, but sort of agreed.
when they grow up, this isn't really going to change. It's just going to become Netflix shows, and whatever ideology is portrayed as popular within the area that they live in. That's just how it is with a lot of people. And you can complain about it, but the thing is you really can't fault people for it, because again, a lot of it is genetic. There was actually a very recent study that a lot of people were talking about on X about this. That was a genetic association study of human personality types, which showed that big
personality
five
types. That's true.
So openness.
It's true, but also you observe your parents very, very closely when you're very young, and you tend to develop a personality based on one or both of your parents. So that's also part of it.
To experience, neuroticism, conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion. Those things have, to some degree, a genetic component. People are not the same. People are not equal. And really, it's just kind of obvious if you just look at a few basic things. For instance, one question you could ask yourself that could prove this even without some of the more recent studies on genetics is, why isn't everybody Leonardo da Vinci? The average poor person in a first world country today, not just a middle class or upper middle class or rich person, the average poor individual in a first world country has greater economic access to resources and greater intellectual access to things like the library for basically free than Leonardo da Vinci did back when he was alive.
Yep.
And so why aren't all of these people becoming brilliant inventors? And the answer is because people are just innately different. And this just highlights the importance of studying psychology and studying its impact on how people think. If you only study philosophy and you only study economics, but you skip out on how people actually think, then you might actually fall for this high IQ projection scheme. And I know because I used to be one of the libertarians that fell for it. I myself used to be one of the people who's like, oh, culture doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is truth. And that was projection. It's me assuming that, oh, this is what matters
Culture
to me.
is how you interpret truth.
And then I studied psychology and realized how wrong that was. And here's the big kicker. Marxists, neo-Marxists especially, understand this. They get it very well. A lot of times when they try to say, oh, you're being distracted by the culture war, or that the culture war was designed by the capitalists to prevent the proletariat from achieving class consciousness, they're actually just tricking you into ignoring their subversive tactics. And so they know that worming their way into the media and injecting their ideology into, say, Saturday morning cartoons, well, it may sound like a silly strategy, but the thing is, it's actually not, because it is generally one of the ways that people come to believe things. That is part of the reason why neo-Marxists control so many of our intellectual institutions these days. It is precisely because they walked into these institutions and started subverting them from within, because they understand that subverting the media is an effective way to spread their ideology. And one of the ways that they get away with this subversion is by tricking people who are against their ideology into thinking that nothing is really going on. Hence why they viciously deny it when it's called out, even if the evidence against them is obvious. Or to summarize, as this post from X puts it, culture reflects attitudes and people as a whole. If you aren't talking about culture, you aren't looking at people. And the neo-Marxists and the far left and the communists, they understand this. And they use culture to talk to the people, and then they try to trick you into thinking it doesn't matter, so that way you're not looking at people. You're just looking inward at your echo chamber.
Well, culture, so people saying they're using culture to look at people and interact with people, that's not right. Culture is definitionally the interaction of people. When people interact with each other, culture is formed. It is the thing that you're doing. Like you're socializing, and then the end result, what you would get from it, new connections, new relations, new ideas, is culture. So culture is not a thing that you tap into. Culture is a response, and then you respond to culture by doing more things with other people.
And are therefore a non-threat to their schemes. Getting the Rothbardian free marketeers to just sit in an echo chamber in some Discord somewhere is precisely what neo-Marxists want you to do. They want you to think that things like Gamergate don't matter. They want you to think that you are above the culture war, as it's called. Because by doing that, by tricking you into believing it doesn't matter, they thus remove you from the competition within these institutions, allowing them to retain
keep
complete
projecting
control.
their shit on
and
the
thus
kids.
This allows them to get away with their tactic of using the mob to try and brute force random organizations to bending the knee to their cause. This is a big reason why my own channel, I tend to have my content go back and forth between libertarian theory, refuting random things, and culture issues. Or as I responded to some YouTubers, Kirsche and Leaflet, about the woke mob trying to get companies to cater to their ideology, said, this is why I try to explain to other lolberts that culture matters. We need to hold these organizations financially accountable for hating us, or else we will never counteract the leftists who are constantly encouraging them to hate us. The neo-Marxists know that as long as they have the loudest voice on cultural issues, then that is what other organizations will adopt and reflect in their own policy.
Voice of what happens after those interactions.
Another argument
people,
I see
the loudest
comes from
voice, what
these
comes
types
out,
themselves,
the cream of the crop, the cream of the slop, even, yay. But the cream of the crop, what comes of those interactions and is the thing that you memorize, the thing that's memorable. That is culture. That's the dominant thing that happens. So when a bunch of people come together at a convention, there's hundreds of interactions of all the people at the convention, but the one or two big events that happen, the guy that yelled loudly at some famous, VTuber or something, whatever ends up happening is what dominates the culture. Culture is the stuff that stands out. It's the stuff that has risen to the top. Normal interactions happen all the time, but the aggregate average kind of lowers a bunch of things and has a couple of peaks in it. And those peaks are the things that we consider exploitable culture.
To again believe they're above the culture war. And it's a bit of a kerfuffle, a bit of a mistaken argument. And it can be summarized by this post here. Why did the Trump camp share the Obama monkey video this week? Regardless if you think it was racist or hilarious, it's because when they fail on policy, they pivot to a culture war. And both sides do it because it's a uniparty and predictable. And I can definitely see why a lot of people fall for this one,
it's
because
kind of a
it's
distraction
mostly
thing.
true. Yes, when a politician screws up and their policies don't do what they claim that they would do, or they pass policies that are the opposite of what they claimed they would pass when they were running for office, kind of the old meme of, but I didn't vote for this, the voter says, lol, LMAO, said the politician. Because, of course, elected officials don't actually have to do what they're elected to do. But that's, of course, the democracy discussion, which is a different discussion altogether. The issue here is that this is actually an example of an association fallacy, mixed a little bit with the fallacy of the indistributed middle. For instance, you may have heard the error all A are B and all C are B, therefore all A are C, which is incorrect. For instance, then you'd have to concede that all apples are fruits, all oranges are fruits, therefore all apples are oranges, which isn't actually true. Yes, it is true that liars and scammers are often politicians, and yes, it's true that politicians like to engage in distractions when their policies fail. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the distractions they use are inherently lies themselves. They're just trying to get the spotlight away from them as an individual. But that does not mean that where they've moved the spotlight to is somewhere that doesn't actually matter in the grand scheme of things. And I see a lot of people fall for this one because, again, it's also to some...
One One of the keys is don't distract someone to something that doesn't matter, because if someone sees it doesn't matter, they won't engage and they'll go right back to what the original topic was. A good distraction always engages, it always matters in some way. So if you swap from something that is of a given flavor to a different flavor but equally as potent, that's like swapping from, your dinner to dessert. Okay, cool. People are going to swap to dessert. Then they're not going to want to eat more steak. Oh no, why would you do that when you just had your pudding?
Degree in association fallacy. It's very easy to associate the idea of
strategy.
Culture war with dishonest politicians and then come to the conclusion that the entire discussion itself is just a big fat scam. But that's actually invalid reasoning. Culture absolutely matters, and that's why they like to turn the spotlight to culture. Because when a politician screws up, they can either distract people with a real issue or distract people with a fake issue. And as it turns out, distracting people with a real issue just so happens to have greater long-term effects and works for a lot longer because, again, it's a real issue. If politicians used fake issues as a distraction all the time, then, well, it wouldn't really be a very good distraction, would it? People would just immediately quickly realize that whatever they were talking about was nonsense, and then the spotlight would go right back to the politicians and their failures. And that's why politicians, again, use cultural issues as their favorite red herring. Red herrings are more effective when they are true. Another thing I've noticed is that the type of libertarians who believe that culture doesn't matter or that we're above the culture war, blah, 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 etc., is that they're often the same libertarians who reject Hans Hermann Hoppe. And it usually comes from a place of them misunderstanding Hoppe's work as works of pragmatism, thinking that Hoppe is just a prag whose goal is to subvert libertarianism into neo-Nazism, which is quite sad because the exact opposite is actually true. Libertarians getting involved in culture and finding that culture mattering to libertarians is actually an excellent strategy that avoids pragmatism, because it allows libertarianism to accomplish wins against the communists using physical removal, which is an entirely valid libertarian strategy that is not pragmatic at all, and is in fact necessary for a liberty-based society to last more than one generation. That is what Hoppe's work actually proves. And it is actually the left pragmatists who dislike that, because they don't like to be told that being a total degenerate wouldn't actually work in libertarian society in practice. But the reality is libertarian philosophy is a philosophy of essentially just property rights, and either abolishing or at the very least minimizing the non-productive class, aka the people who are privileged to be allowed to ignore other people's private property rights. And the thing is, tolerance is not a part of those rights. You are not required to tolerate someone on your property. If someone is being a dick to you and they're in your house, you should have the right to tell them to leave. You should have the right to engage in physical removal. That is part of what property rights are. That is not pragmatic at all. And people who are familiar with libertarian philosophy know that this is honestly kind of basic stuff. But here's the thing that the left libertarians don't like. You scale this simple concept up to that of society and multiple societies, and it becomes clear that cultural values, because they are again intrinsically tied to basically everything, well, they become a big deciding factor in the value of that society as a whole, as it directly affects its sustainability and ability to pass on the torch and survive for longer than a decade or so. For example, social welfare in a libertarian society would not be an entitlement statist-based program like our welfare system we have in many first world countries today in the West. Rather, it would become a privatized system. It would be a system based on, again, private property rights. And thus it makes financial sense based to physically...
what do we call them? We had a name for them. Small societies and groups. You had like you would have a group of people that would come together and go, we all want to have health insurance effectively. We want to pay for each other's health care because health insurance didn't exist really at the time. So they'd pool money in and have just a pool that every month everyone pays a little in. And then if someone had something happen to them, they'd take from the pool and go, cool, that's good. And because you all communally put everything together, you got better deals on things. You could get a certain doctor to work just with your group instead of working in general, so they knew they always had work. That would make the prices go even lower. There were benefits to these systems. And then that got completely replaced by, well, but everyone has health insurance now. Everyone pays in, and that just undoes all the systems and makes prices go up again. There's, what do they call it? Lodges. They used to call them lodges, is the old practice. But we don't have lodges anymore. Lodges were voluntary. It was if you want to be in a lodge, you can. A lot of times it was very, very specific how you got in a lodge, and in a lot of cases you couldn't just get in. They'd go, no, we don't want your type here because you don't think the way we do. So a lot of them, it would be like, here's one for if you get fired from your job, you have unemployment. Before we had official unemployment systems. So if someone gets fired from their job, unemployment, the group pays for it. But then the group enforces within a month, you have to have proof that you have applied and gone to meetings and interviews for at least 5 jobs, like that kind of thing. Like you actively have to be trying to get a job. You're bettering yourself out of the process. So these strict rules were either do it or we kick you from the group and you're cut off. The point was they didn't just want to hand out money. They wanted to hand out goodwill. They wanted to make people better off, and money was just the oil that wet the gears. So they would pool money, but they would also pool effort. They'd go, oh, someone's house got knocked down. Well, let's all go build part of his house, right? It was this communal thing that would happen. And we basically got rid of that. In some states, it's illegal to form a lodge now. I forget their name, but the guys that ride around on little mopeds, not mopeds, like go-karts in parades. Those guys with little fez hats, they're a lodge. Technically the Freemasons technically are a lodge. They're a super secretive one, and that's kind of where it came from, because when it became illegal to run a lodge, if you had a public listing and didn't let someone in, that's what they would make illegal, the ability for you to control who was allowed in your club, effectively. They went, no, you can't. You have to let everyone in. Well, okay, if you don't, then we shut down your club. So they would just go super secret. They go, yeah, well, we're just not going to say what we do or who's allowed or what our criteria is. It's just all between us. And that's where you get the lodges that are super secret societies. It's like, they're not really secret societies. They were just like handling healthcare and shit. But because no one knew what it was, it became a big old deal. It's like, oh, what are they doing behind closed doors? Well, they're helping each other not like die during the Depression.
Would be a system based on, again, private property rights. And thus it makes financial sense to physically remove those who seek to mooch off of that welfare system, rather than as a temporary way to help get themselves out of trouble. And thus societies, by a simple process of natural selection, would end up adopting more low time preference cultural values, which tend to lean conservatives. We've actually seen this in history. If you look at the private welfare systems of the past,
The
before
Templars.
the New Deal, we see how they often had behavioral requirements in order to maintain or apply for membership. And those requirements ultimately tended to frown upon degenerate behavior. And it's really not that hard to understand why. I mean, just imagine yourself as the private owner of one such system. Looking at your finances, you notice that people who are hard drug abusers tend to be, well, net negatives, almost always finding themselves in distress and in need of assistance from the mutual aid fund, and they just keep screwing up over and over again. Thus, the incentive to require prospective members to, at the very least, submit to rehab and make a concentrated effort to overcome their addiction becomes the obvious answer to your problem, or just physically removing them altogether by banning drug abusers from joining the mutual aid fund. Because social welfare already is
he's
hard
calling
enough
it by a
to take
different
care of the
name, but
people
that's
who
basically what
fall
lodges
ill to
were.
no fault of their
Mutual
own.
aid funds.
So why should you be taking a profit loss for the people who are the cause of their own problem? So it just makes sense in an actual free society to not be degenerate. It's just more profitable in the long run. And there's also just an inherent problem of hypocrisy of any left libertarian who takes issue with this and tries to reject Hoppe's work or downplay his importance. Here we have the Classical Liberal Caucus of Texas posting a long time ago, which by the way, don't hold them accountable for this because they're now under better leadership. But basically they posted this typical meme of basically saying Hoppe bad, thanking all these philosophers for their contributions to libertarian theory, but not Hoppe. To which I responded this: there's a much more direct question for libertarians who reject Hoppe. How exactly would you stop a private city society with right-wing values from forming without violating the NAP? The answer, hilariously, is that you must form a libertarian private society of your own and physically remove the Hoppians, which means you have become us. You have admitted that we are right. Are you going to physically remove yourselves next? Either that, or you create a state that bans any form of private cities from existing, in which case you have ceased to be libertarian.
So the NAP, in case you don't know, is the non-aggression principle that a lot of libertarians drive by. They say, well, no one should aggress on anyone else. Violence should never be put towards anyone. You should never restrict anyone from doing something. Basically, let people do their own thing. And that's great until you have a lodge where you're agreeing with other people, usually over contract, that you're going to pool together resources for reasons and whatnot. And there's membership requirements and all that. Well, that means that you have to then say, well, no, we don't want you or you or you or you, drug users and all that stuff, from joining our lodge. Well, under the non-aggression principle, they would go, well, stop me. I'm just going to join anyway and just take money. Like, okay, well, then aggression has to be put in. You have to enforce that this is our money, not yours, etc. So your freedom to choose what you do with your money then is at risk. So to be a libertarian, you then would have to take up arms and say, no, you can't take our money. You can't just take our goods, take our aid. Basically, in this case, it would be, no, you can't join our club. So the non-aggression principle is not absolute. And that's the problem here is, well, you have to disobey it. It can't be an absolute that you will never aggress on other people. You have to enforce things. Enforcement is the problem. You start a law, the law has to be enforced, and it's always, always, always enforced with violence, state violence, political violence, legal violence. It's some form of force being used. So without that, you have no laws, which is why I say that they're just as bad as anarchists. Anarchists are pluralized. They're singularized on that chart. You know, the what quadrant are you in? Basically, that's the difference between the two. But they both go, well, there should be no rules, no laws. Just let people do what they want. And that sounds good in theory until you realize that you need to have some rules. You need to have some aggression.
The reality is that society needs some kind of rule of law in order to function and facilitate economic growth.
He says
Libertarianism simply replaces that law with a system that is in line with voluntary association instead of by force through a non-productive class. This means there will still be rules.
Yeah, that's
is not
the mid
no
of
rules.
the chart is
and
just
I'd like to add to
voluntarism.
this also means that libertarianism is not when no culture. Libertarianism is when society and rule places the nap first, which means that if people do not want to associate with crappy culture and don't want to associate with those who litter the streets, and a private society doesn't want to have people camping on the sidewalks while shooting up heroin, well then removing them is entirely within their rights within a libertarian society, and is in fact easier to do and more effective to do than how Western society and rules currently work today. Anybody who denies this and says that, oh well, that's authoritarian,
it's never been done
people out
quite
of society, well then you also have to claim that the
I wouldn't
map
say that
itself
with
is
certainty,
authoritarian,
but
in which case the
agree.
left libertarian has simply become a communist with extra steps. And so this just all brings us to the question, what should the libertarian strategy be in regards to culture then? And I believe the optimal strategy is actually just a two-pronged approach. The first is that we need to start actually fighting the Marxists where they are, as opposed to just constantly infighting. If you believe in liberty and believe in the free market, and you are in a position to influence.
Yeah, even pirates had rules they went by. Even the most ruthless went by those rules. That's right, Husky. That's kind of the point is you have to have rules, because if you don't have rules, you don't have society. You have to set boundaries for people to be told, don't cross into my boundary, let me do my own thing. But the boundary has to be enforced. There is always some boundary, and always at that point, force being used to enforce it. It's what enforcement means. It's applying force, enforce. So the idea that you can just have no force whatever is just basically, it's an ideal that will never come to fruition. It's not how the world works.
One of these institutions, then you should do so. A lot of people who get into libertarian theory, especially the people who reject Hoppe, which again is often the libertarians who think that culture wars don't matter, it comes from the misunderstanding of, again, thinking that tolerance and acceptance is a libertarian value. And no, they're not. You do not have to leave culture alone. You do not have to just accept the garbage propaganda that neo-Marxists are constantly.
Tolerance and acceptance are not the same thing, and they are definitely on different entire playing fields. Like, acceptance, forcing someone, say, oh, you have to accept this. That's saying you have to, opinion-wise, agree with this thing. That's controlling an opinion. Tolerance is, I don't care what your opinion is, just let it exist, let it happen. And that's a neutral stance, but it's neutral in the wrong way. It's hurting someone and helping someone else, and in the end result, the total net product is neutral. You don't want to hurt anyone in an ideal scenario. So the correct thing to do would be, oh, well, I'll do my thing, you do your thing, let's draw a line in the sand, right? Then you don't have to tolerate someone. You just have your own space where you don't have to worry about it, but that space has to be enforced.
churning out using their connections and positions within the media. If you are in a position where you can gain control of these and do something about it, then you should. It is entirely within libertarian values to do something like publishing a nonfiction book and having a story that reflects those values. It is, again, a very weird blind side that currently exists within libertarian strategy to just ignore the culture war, when it is in fact a fantastic way to talk to ordinary, normal, everyday people in a way that doesn't sound completely preachy. Because when you just come to someone, and if you were to walk up to someone on the street and just say, hey, do you want to talk about Rothbard's theories on the anatomy of the state? I mean, let's just be real for a moment. You're going to come across as a total autist. That is not how the average person comes to believe things.
But if something is already popular and being talked about, and then you provide your perspective, that's a better way to talk about it.
Nap worshippers, those type of libertarians who look down on these cultural issues. And yet cultural issues are a libertarian strategy towards getting more libertarians that does not violate the nap. It is actually one of the most effective non-pragmatic strategies we have. And yet what I'll often see, for example, in my own channel, is I'll make a video calling out some journalists for some Marxist subversion, and yet one of these naptists will come in and go, oh, this is culture war schlop. Because apparently, when I was not aware of it, not calling out neo-Marxist subversions of our media institutions and just doing nothing while the neo-Marxists continue to retain complete control and brainwash the next generation with their nonsense, apparently it just became an unspoken rule in libertarian circles that we're just going to let the neo-Marxists do that. And
this is the same thing I was saying about when developers and whatnot that are making a bad game, when someone's saying, oh, well, just if you don't like it, then vote with your wallet. They know that there's no way to negatively vote. They're saying either buy our game and give us positive affirmation of what we're doing, that it's good, or don't buy the game and we'll just ignore it. Everyone ignore any of the bad that's happening. Well, the same thing's true here, saying, well, you're not allowed to talk about the things that we don't want you to. Don't talk about it. If you don't like it, don't talk about it. Well, then how is anyone going to say that it's a bad thing and change the discourse? How do you change the actual culture? You have to interact with it, positive and negative.
Not push back against it at all. And yes, I know I'm kind of breaking one of my own rules here and engaging in some libertarian infighting with this video here, but it really needs to be called out and emphasized just how toxic this mentality is to the liberty movement as a whole. It's like they're addicted to losing or something. Or in other words, de-Marxist subversion of our cultural institutions is good, actually. It is completely within libertarian ethics and philosophy to do so. It does not violate the nap in any way. It is basically free real estate and free libertarian strategy that the current libertarian party officials just kind of look at and look down on and just completely ignore. And that's ridiculous. It is untapped potential, and again, it just completely ignores how psychology works. The idea that everyone will just suddenly come to their senses and decide to be a philosopher and decide to aggressively study economics, and that everyone would do so if they just had the right environment, well, that mentality falls into the same fallacious thinking of the liberals who fell for the tabula rasa
When you go
scam,
into cultural topics, you're going into things that affect people right now because it's more immediate to what's happening to actual people.
This is just not the case. It is not true. People are different, and many psychological traits are genetic. Libertarians need to accept this and move past this. The other prong of this strategy is just attacking the current culture issues from a libertarian perspective. And one very good angle of this is showing how a lot of the cultural decay is actually due to, again, the welfare state. Here's a really good article from Mises Wire, The Cultural Consequences of the Welfare State. The basic idea of it is just using the state to entitle people to the things that the mutual aid societies of the past used to do instead. Early systems in the 1800s being compulsory insurance for accident, health, disability, and age, pensions, and then called this state socialism. And again, these are things that people could already buy and join from private markets. And here's the thing, this state socialism was not done to make these programs more efficient, but rather it was done to generate dependence and loyalty. It certainly wasn't because it's more profitable to do things this way. In fact, quite the opposite. This ends up costing society way more in the long run. But the bigger problem is that it gets rid of the physical removal aspect, which would ordinarily allow the free market to weed out degeneracy. And here's the thing, this has been going on.
It's the same thing. It's going, well, now that everyone is by law guaranteed access to this social safety net, no one can be excluded, which means no one gets to vote, no, I don't want it, because you can't opt out. You can't say, I don't want this thing. I don't want to participate. So saying, well, you have to participate. It's only positive votes. It's the same entire rhetoric that, yeah, we'll just make it so that there's no way to complain, no way to make it negative, only reinforce the system.
On for so long that people have essentially forgotten about it. One of the key issues with libertarianism I
until it
see
becomes
coming
so
from
normalized that you
general
forget
bog
about it.
standard conservatives is that they think that what we're seeing in our cultural degeneracy and decline of the West is due to woke capitalism, when in fact the exact opposite is true. It's because we got rid of the financial constraints on degeneracy and replaced them with entitlement, as the welfare state completely lacks the behavioral requirements that naturally show up in mutual aid societies of the past.
It
And
lacks
thus
the
crime
checks
rates,
and balances that keep you
structural
from wasting
unemployment,
money.
Parasitism, psychopathy, and hedonism have increased. And the article explains the reason. It's that for the public, government moderation has only disadvantages. When you receive a subsidy without any kind of quid pro quo, there is no incentive to be more productive in the future. As a result,
Yep.
productive activity
Now the
and
quote comes into
long-term
play.
forecast decline, redistribution taxes to most productive individuals by removing their incentive to produce, leading to the infantilization and moral degeneration of civil society. And to add to this, the thing that a lot of people look at today is the question of public trust and the failure of multiculturalism, with the standard complaint being that Western society keeps getting flooded with immigrants, a lot of whom are strangely non-productive. And the reason why is because the welfare state kind of incentivizes them to come here without actually needing to be productive. And so now Western civilization is finding itself in a position where the people who built the society and are funding that society, well, we find ourselves being forced to fund the welfare of our effective replacement.
And we
because
can't
the welfare
vote out
state
of
is
it.
again an entitlement, it doesn't actually have any kind of behavioral or cultural or any kind of value requirement to it. And by value in this context, I mean social values, the need to be a civilized human being. Because these entitlement systems lack that, well, the situation we find ourselves in was inevitable. Or as the article points out, the welfare state has led to the elimination of the responsibility to act decently, encouraging incivility, vandalism, and
No
law breaking.
punishment,
And
no
honestly,
repercussions.
when you take a step back and look at
No
it from
negative
an outside-in
reinforcement. You have to
perspective,
have
it's kind of
negative
obvious.
with your
When you
positive.
eliminate the need to be a decent person in order to have access to the social safety net of a society, then, well, surprise, surprise, people are going to come in and have no incentive to be decent people. And what libertarians need to do is we need to point out that these issues with cultural degeneracy, they're just going to keep happening so long as we have this entitlement system. Because a lot of conservatives, they'll just go down the rabbit hole of becoming a white nationalist or something in response to this. But then they'll want to keep the welfare state. They don't want to do anything about getting rid of the welfare. And they don't realize that if you have a welfare state with, say, white people only, so ethno-nationalist socialism,
you haven't
I mean,
solved the
sure, that
problem.
might be a little better than multicultural socialism, but it's still socialism and it's still entitlement, and so people will still lack the incentive to actually be decent human beings. And so you're really not fixing much unless you get rid of the entitlement. With the
You've
irony
just
being
made it so
that
that everyone
the welfare
shares
state
a
actually
trait,
hurts the
not
poor because the
everyone
welfare state makes
meets
society
criteria
suck. And so
that
when
actually matter.
libertarians take a step away from this and just completely ignore the culture war, we're kind of giving Marxists a platform to sell their own solution. Their solution to cultural degeneracy, their answer to why the streets have so much trash, why there's a lack of social trust, why is housing so expensive, why do we have all these homeless people? Well, the neo-Marxists, they like to get their little claws on the media and sell the idea that this is all because of capitalism, which is a complete lie. It was all caused by state socialism. And yet the neo-Marxists are constantly
There's
creating
never
stories
been
within
a
video
negative to
games
capitalism.
and within movies and TV shows and books, etc., and have fully ingrained themselves into intellectual institutions. And then they use the cultural decay that's largely caused by them as evidence of late-stage capitalism, selling the idea that it's
You hear it, it comes up all the time. When someone says late stage capitalism, it's corporatism. There is an official name for it, corporatism. Actual capitalism, like capitalism that actually involves dumping capital back into your projects, that is without any downsides. It's people winning and winning on both sides. Someone that runs a business wins, the people on the other end buying the product, they win, and they drive each other, and then new businesses form, and that makes competition, and that makes even better products come out. There's no downsides to it. The only downside is that eventually the person that actually means well gets taken out of the business and replaced by shareholders, and then at that point, it's still not capitalism's problem because that's a corporation.
the lack of equity and lack of free stuff and lack of entitlement that's causing all of these issues. And when libertarians, when we walk away from this, when we say that, oh, the culture wars are beneath us, well, we're just handing the neo-Marxists a free victory. We're not talking to the average person, to the average guy on the street, in a way that he will actually care to listen. We're just gonna let them say that the solution to all of our problems is more government intervention, more free stuff, more entitlements, more tolerance and acceptance of multiculturalism, more moral relativism, and other such nonsense. And in response to this, I'll just point out to a simple fact, and I don't mean to brag here, but there's a reason why my channel broke the normal 100k subscriber libertarian curse. And it's really not a big secret. I just make content about some of the issues that everyday normal people are talking about and explain why the neo-Marxist solutions that are being offered are entirely fraudulent solutions. Because if you want to really spread the message of liberty and explain why the free market is a good thing, you gotta talk about issues that the average person actually cares about. It really is that simple. Anyways, that's all I have to say.
In a way, that's a really
Please
good
like,
quote.
Share, comment, and
This right here is a really good quote to pinpoint what I was saying, even when we were on game videos, right? If you aren't talking about culture, you aren't looking at people. If you aren't looking at people, you are not actually affecting the people. So you can talk about high-level concepts when it comes to politics all you want. Use all of your isms, talk like crazy about what should be, what has worked, what doesn't work, etc. But it doesn't apply to anyone. It's too abstracted from actual day-to-day living. But culture works from the other side. So if you start with culture, you're closer to the people. You're not necessarily looking at the people. You might be looking upward at the greater picture, but you're at least closer to the people. You are closer to what affects people. So I can agree with this.
it really is that simple. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you like my content, you can support me on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch, or again, by checking out this video sponsored
I recommend
private internet
Mentis.
access. Thanks again
He has
for
really
watching.
cool things.
That
He
is
makes
all.
little
Till
funerals and
next
stuff.
time.
Definitely worth following him if you're at all into any. He talks about a lot of libertarian things, but I'd say he actually just kind of goes over problems with the left and the right in general. And he doesn't really push libertarianism. He'll propose libertarian solutions to things, but he doesn't necessarily push it. He's just pointing out problems that he sees, and that's pretty cool. He does really good videos on a lot of topics. Has fun graphics, does a lot of good AI stuff now. I like the additions of that. Give him a like. Enjoy. I recommend Mentis. It's not for everyone, but if it's your kind of cup of tea, the higher level thinking on politics, he breaks it down to like mid-level. Yeah, good stuff.